You've got this.
Hi, and welcome to You've Got This. Today I'm going to show you how to make a basic sourdough bread loaf. So you have your sourdough starter, someone gifted it to you, or you made it yourself and it's ready to go. Now what? That's what I'm going to show you. So I have been waiting to make this video for you until I have the perfect time, the perfect setup in my kitchen, but it turns out the perfect time doesn't exist. So I am going to show you how to make sourdough bread in regular life. Here we go. What I have here is active starter. All that active starter means is it is doubled and bubbly from the time I fed it. I don't know if you can see. Right there, we are doubled. Put the rubber band around it when I fed it so that it's easy to tell when it's doubled. That's what active starter means, doubled and bubbly. So if that's in your bowl that you made the night before you want to bake, or if it's still in your jar, doubled and bubbly is active, go for it. Does not need to come to room temperature if it's been living in the refrigerator either, because our other ingredients are going to change the temperature anyway. So here we go. Active starter, I am using all-purpose unbleached flour. You can use any kind of wheat flour that you want for this. I like all-purpose unbleached because it's inexpensive for the all-purpose, and the unbleached makes me feel like it's healthier. So there we go. Using salt, this is Himalayan salt, but you can use any salt you want. And this is purified water from the refrigerator filter, but I've left it open overnight so that the chlorine can evaporate out of it. Chlorine will slow down your yeast activity from your sourdough starter. So if you just put the filtered water in a jar and leave it open overnight, the chlorine will evaporate out and then you can use it, or bottled water is fine. So let's get started. We have our bowl on our scale. Just gonna turn that on. This particular recipe that I'm doing makes 2 loaves of bread. I almost always make this, and if you stick with me to the end, I'll tell you why I always do the 2 loaves of bread. So this will be 200 grams of active starter. In this jar, it usually holds 250, 300 grams. So that's why I like this size, so that I can just use it straight from the jar. My favorite motto for sourdough is it just doesn't matter. The exact numbers just doesn't matter. We're going for guidelines here in recipes, and 200 grams of active starter is the guideline. 236, perfect. As you can see, there's not a whole lot of starter left in the jar, but this is going to be the perfect amount to feed and keep going, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So 236 grams of active starter. I'm going to clear that out and put in my water. This is 700 grams of water that it calls for. Boom. 710. Looks great. I'm going to use a dough whisk to mix this water and sourdough starter up. You don't have to have this. You can use a spoon. You can use your hands. But I have it, so I use it. So the reason I'm mixing this in first is just to get the starter to start dissolving in the water so that it's easier to mix later. But again, it just doesn't matter. If you put all of your ingredients in and mixed it up, you'd be just fine. Now, because I am using an all white flour with no whole wheat in it, I'm gonna mix all of my ingredients at once. If you were using whole wheat, you'd wanna do what's called an autolyse. Autolyse is just mixing up the flour and water and letting it sit. 30 minutes, an hour, whatever you want to do, letting it sit is going to soften up that bran so that it gives more rise, it makes it develop more fully. But because we don't have bran in our white flour, we don't need to do the autolyse. We'll be just fine. Then once that's all mixed up, we are going to take our flour and go for 1,100 grams. Now this is especially where there's a lot of flexibility. This particular recipe that I'm using is considered a low hydration recipe, which means the dough is not very wet. It's a perfect one to start on. You really get the feel for it. Or when it's very wet, it kind of feels soupy. It's like something might be wrong. I'm not sure. Not wrong. The other recipes are wonderful also. There's different nuances that will come about in the finished product of a drier dough versus a wetter dough, but this is a perfect one to start on. So I always like to teach people this, and it's a fabulous bread. I continue using this often, even though I do like to experiment with the higher hydration, wetter doughs also, but there's a lot of flex and play in this. If you did not have a scale, you could still make sourdough. That is how much. It just does not matter. What I want you to get here are the concepts. So here we go. Okay, the rest of the bag is 1,096. Perfect. Because it just doesn't matter. So now we're gonna get the salt. The salt is 22 grams for the 2 loaves of bread, which happens to be exactly 1 tablespoon. So that makes it easy. Over the top it goes. I prefer to put the salt over the top of the flour because if it goes directly into the water with the starter, it does funny things, tightening up the starter and making it feel kind of slimy. I don't love that. So I do it this way. You feel free to make this your own. Put it in whatever order you want, but this is how I like to do it. So we're just gonna get this mixed up till it forms a nice sticky dough. All right, there we go. So now what we have is a nice sticky dough that's shaggy but holds its shape. So that right there is what we're going for. I'm gonna put a lid on this and let it sit untouched for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes, I'm gonna come and do a round of stretch and folds. That is going to be very similar to kneading, but it's a little more gentle. So I'll show you that when we come back. All right, now that we've used up almost all of our jar of starter or mother, we're just going to refeed it. Now, the important thing to remember here is just to make sure you put in more flour than you have leftover starter. So if you still had a lot of starter, dump that out either into a jar to keep in your refrigerator for later for discard recipes. Discard is active starter is doubled and bubbly. Discard is when it sinks back down. Fully fermented, but not bubbly anymore. So that's what discard is. So this one has, I'm gonna guess about 50 grams of starter in there. So I'm gonna feed it with basically what I took out of it because I was happy with the amount that was in the jar. And that's gonna be fed with equal parts water and flour. So if I want 200 grams to feed this starter with, I'm gonna feed it with 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, mix it up and set it aside, let it do its thing. And that is how you take care of the mother. So here we go. Turn on that scale. 100 grams, approximately 107, looks great. Put on that lid and swirl it around a little bit. Same concept as the bread making. We're just gonna let that starter dissolve in the water to help us mix it in later. Clear that scale, open a new bag of flour because I finished the last one. I always make a mess with this, so let's see how I do. There we go, 109, close enough. And look, you guys, no mess. My favorite way to mix this is with a butter knife because it easily scrapes off when you're done. You just get that mixed up in there. Oh, well, there's my mess. All right. Get it mixed up so that all of the flour gets wet. You just want to make sure you don't have anything dry in there because if it's dry, it will not ferment. And we need fully fermented flour to give us the yeast that we want in our recipes. All right, there we go. Now that that is mixed up, we're gonna make sure that our rubber band is in a good place. Yeah, looks great. To show us where we mixed it so that we can tell when it's doubled and bubbly, so we have our active starter. This can either be left on your counter so that it will ferment so that it can be used again in 4 hours, or it can be put in the refrigerator where it will slowly ferment through the food that you've given it. And it can stay in there for several days to up to a week without being used and be just fine. It really depends on the frequency that you want to use it. Now, I bake with sourdough pretty much every day, so what I'm going to do is leave this on the counter, let it ferment most of the way, and then pop it in the refrigerator. Because in the morning, if I wake up and decide I want to make something else, I want to have it most of the way fermented so it's ready to go. So that's what we're going to do. Oh, pro tip, don't crank down the lid. Twist it, but leave it kind of loose, because this will build up pressure while the bubbles are forming, while it's fermenting. And if you leave it on the counter with the lid cranked down, it will explode. Ask me how I know. All right, you guys, while we're waiting for our next step with the dough, I wanted to explain a couple of the concepts that are unique to sourdough that's different from any other baking. Because when you first get sourdough, it can be intimidating because you just really don't know what to do with it. And why would you? You've never baked with sourdough before. So most of the things that you'll encounter, there's a recipe for. You're gonna be just fine. But there's a couple of things that I want to explain now. And one of them is how to care for the mother, just what I was explaining before. Make sure you feed it with more flour than you have leftover starter. The ratios for this, people will talk about a lot, feeding it with 1-1-1, 1-2-2, 1-5-5. All that means is the first number is how much starter is left, and the other numbers are water and flour. So if it was 1-1-1, we would have 1 part starter, 1 part flour, 1 part water. 50 grams starter, 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. If it was 1-2-2, which is likely what we did here, it's 50 grams starter, 100 grams flour, 100 grams water. So that's the 1 part to 2 parts to 2 parts. That's how that works. Making sure you have more flour than you have leftover starter. Make sure that all of your little yeast friends in there get a bite. That's it. Letting it ferment until it's doubled and bubbly. Make sure that all of your yeast friends are present when you want to make some fabulous sourdough baked goods. So while it's fermenting, it's replicating itself. Right now, what I have in this jar is mostly just flour. If I tried to bake with it right now, it wouldn't have the yeast power that it needs in order to rise a loaf of bread. So waiting for it to be doubled and bubbly is crucial to your success in sourdough baking. But when it's at its peak, that's when it's going to be the strongest. It's going to be fully awake and ready to go and ready to do some heavy lifting. When it sinks back down, it starts to go to sleep. So if you are asked in the middle of the night to get up and do some heavy lifting, you'd probably say go pound sand. But if you are already awake and ready to go and someone asks you to lift something heavy, be like, sure, hold my drink. So same goes for sourdough. The other concept that I want to talk about is the concept of fermentation. Now this is huge. This is much more of an art than a science. You can't go solely off of time for sourdough fermentation because a lot of this has to do with different factors. Has to do with how strong your starter is, has a lot to do with the temperature in your house, has a lot to do with how much sourdough starter you have versus how much flour you have. So learning the concepts of fermentation and how to read the dough is so important to sourdough success. And if you get it, you've got it. You can play around with all of the other factors, all of the other ratios and recipes and ingredients. If you've got the concept of sourdough fermentation, you have got sourdough. As we do this spread here, I'm going to walk you through what to look for to know when the sourdough is ready for the next step. So it is the middle of winter right now. It's December something. No, it's not. It's January. Oh my gosh. It's cold. So this is going to take a lot longer than it would in the middle of the summer. It's currently mid-morning. So if this was the summertime and I started this now, I could likely bake it tonight. But this bread, it's going to take a lot longer to ferment because of the colder temperatures. So this is probably not going to be baked until tomorrow morning. Totally fine, because I understand the concept of fermentation. I can plan on that. The reason I'm starting this now, we have half a loaf of sourdough bread left, so it's time to start some new bread. You'll get into a rhythm, you'll see what works for your family and your lifestyle, and it's gonna be great. All right, you guys, it's been about 30 minutes since we mixed everything up. And like I said before, the 30 minutes isn't crazy important. All we're wanting to do is space out our stretch and folds in the bulk fermentation phase. So the bulk fermentation just means from the time you first mix everything up until you pre-shape the loaf before its final rise. So that time period is called bulk fermentation, and within that time period, we want to get in about 4 sets of stretch and folds. What that's going to do, it's going to tighten up the gluten bond, and it's going to give us more rise in the final bake. So what you want to do is after you wash your hands, leave them wet. I've already washed my hands, but they've dried, so I'm going to wet them again. Wet hands will keep the dough from sticking to you, which is nice. So for a stretch and fold, all you do is you go around the side to the center, fold it over onto itself. You're gonna do that all the way around. And as you can see, we have already moved from our shaggy dough that we first mixed up to a much smoother dough now. So after I've done that stretch and fold all the way around, see how pretty? I'm gonna cover it up and let it sit for another 30 minutes. And we'll come back and do another set. See you then. All right, you guys, we're back for our next round of stretch and folds. It's been about 45 minutes since I did the last one because, you know, life. Usually what I like to do is notice the time that I've started my dough, and then I want to finish the 4 stretch and folds approximately 2.5 hours later. So I started this dough around 11 o'clock today, which would make us finishing the stretch and folds around 1:30. And then the rest of the bulk fermentation will just be done sitting by itself without me touching it. The entire bulk fermentation usually takes between 4 and 4.5 hours, depending on different elements in your kitchen, but that's a good estimate. So we are going to do the next round of stretch and folds now after this has been sitting. I did wash my hands, but let me get them wet again. Boom. So that dough does not stick. Again, around the side, over the middle, a nice gentle press into the middle is all you need. And you can see the longer the time is passing, the more our dough is developing. That's because of the active yeast that's in our starter. It is fermenting and developing the gluten bonds in there. Now, what we're looking for is for this dough to pass a window pane test. Did you see how I flipped that upside down? That is a little thing that I like to do. It makes no difference to the actual dough, but after I fold it, I like to flip it upside down because then when you open it again, you're greeted by the pretty side. So, a little fun tip for you. But what we're looking for this to pass is the window pane test. If you've never heard of that, all it means is you pick up the dough and you spread it thin until you can see light coming through it without it tearing. That means the gluten bonds have formed enough for it to stretch and rise when you bake it. So what we're gonna do, we'll do a little window pane test, but I'm not expecting it to pass right now. You'll just pick it up, stretch it out nice and thin. You can hold it up to a window. Oh, I don't know if you can see this. We have got a lot of gluten already formed there. But see, we have a little tear there and it hasn't gotten super thin yet. So this still needs to develop some, which is fine. We have several more stretch and folds to go. So once that passes the window pane test, that's when you know you have done enough stretch and folds and you can let it sit for the rest of the bulk fermentation. Here we are for our 3rd round of stretch and folds. Ooh, it's getting so nice and smooth. So what it's doing over this time is the yeast is activating and it's producing carbon dioxide bubbles, and that's what gives us the rise. So the longer it goes, the more it's going to do that. Oh, and it's so fun to play with at this point. It's gotten soft and smooth. It's just a beautiful dough. Here we go with those stretch and folds. Again, I like the pretty side to greet me. And there you go. You can see that pretty dough. We're going to do one more round of these, and then we'll let it sit for the rest of its bulk fermentation. We'll check for the window pane test after the next round of stretch and folds, and then I'll tell you what to look for to know when the bulk fermentation has finished and when it's time to shape. Time for our 4th stretch and fold. So let's take a look and see how this is going. It's getting jigglier, which is what we're looking for. I'm just going to once again stretch and fold all the way around. I found that the stretch and fold is something that feels really foreign at first, but you get the hang of it and then it goes really smoothly. All right, ready for a window pane test? Let's see how this goes. I'm going to just take a little chunk of dough, stretch it nice and thin. Look at that. I don't know if you can see light behind that, but it's super thin. This is fantastic. That gluten is beautifully developed. Yeah, there's light. Totally coming through there. There we go. So this is all done. We are going to leave it in our bowl until the bulk fermentation is done. What we're looking for is for a rise of about 50% from when we first mixed it up, and then also when you jiggle the bowl, you want it to shake like Jell-O. So it's going to still be smooth. You don't want to see any big pockets of bubbles in there, but it's going to be risen and jiggly, and that's when we know that our bulk fermentation is done. So I'll check back in with you in about 1.5 hours, 2 hours to check and see if that bulk fermentation has finished. All right, you guys, you know how I said we were coming back about 2 hours later to check on it to see if it was done with its bulk fermentation? Well, it is frigid. The temperature has dropped, so it is now 4 hours since we last met up. And I would now consider this dough to be done with its bulk fermentation. And one may consider this to be the perfect day to be showing you how this is done so that you can see it really doesn't depend very much on timing, and it depends more on reading the dough. So what I was looking for in this dough was for it to have risen about by 50% from when we mixed it, and for it also to have the nice jiggle. See that jiggle when you shake it? I don't know if you can see it, but it's very satisfying to me. I love it. It's also starting to smell like yeast, which is nice. The smell will continue to develop as it finishes its fermentation, but this is a beautiful dough that's ready for the next step, done with bulk fermentation. So what we're going to do is split it into its 2 loaves and pre-shape it. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do this. I'm going to speak to the utilitarian purist who just wants it to be easy and done. And then I'm also going to speak to the bakers who like things to be pretty. It's like, gosh, I hope it tastes good, but I'll be darned if it's not pretty. So we're going to do utilitarian first. I'm going to take a bowl about this size, just doesn't matter, and coat it with olive oil. All you want with the size of the bowl is for there to be room for it to still about double in size as it's finishing its fermentation. So you're gonna take that olive oil. I'm using regular olive oil, not extra virgin, because this can handle the higher temperatures when we bake it in the oven. So you're just going to swish that around the bowl a little bit. And then right here with your dough, since we have a double batch, oh, I didn't wet my hands, hang on. Boom, wet hands. Because we have a double batch here, you're just gonna pick it up around the middle, hourglass style, and pinch it off. Boop, there it goes. Now, what we're gonna do is shape it into a bowl. So this, I know, I didn't say ball, I said bowl. I thought that it was pronounced boule for a while, and I thought that was a really pretty way to say it, but no, the round artisan loaves are bowls. It's fine. The way I'm shaping this is I'm just tucking the bottom under and creating tension on top. So you could do this on the counter with a bench scraper. You can do it however you want to, but all you want is a nice little ball with tension on top. Fun fact, boule is French for ball. Boom. So then you're gonna take your bowl that's coated in olive oil, go upside down so you can get a little coating on top, flip it over so that that seam side is down, and that's it. We're gonna put this lid on there. We can either finish fermenting on the counter. Let's say it was a summer day and I still had 4 hours before I wanted to bake it. I would leave it on the counter, bake it tonight, but it is 5:30 in the evening. So this I'm gonna leave on the counter for a few more hours just to get it jump started in its final fermentation, and then I'm gonna pop it in the refrigerator and I'll tell you what to do after that. But now we're gonna do the pretty one. So right here, I have a dish that's roughly the size of the thing I'm gonna bake it in. And I have an oblong Dutch oven, so this is gonna be perfect. Really, you can use any kind of bowl, any Bantam basket that you want, but I'm going for what I have. You don't need extra things to be able to be successful in sourdough. So I'm gonna take this, I have a thin towel, it's called a tea towel. Just gonna lay that over it like this and dust it with cornstarch. I'm not going to use regular flour to dust it with because I do have the gluten sensitivity, and what I dust it with is not going to be fully fermented. You can use regular flour if you would like. You can use rice flour, you can use cornstarch, you can experiment with all sorts of things, but I'm going to use cornstarch. So I'm just going to take a little bit and dust it over the towel so that our dough doesn't stick to it while it's doing its final fermentation. There we go, that looks good. And then we're gonna do pretty much the same thing that we did with the first loaf with this second one. We're gonna pick it up, just do our little tucks, get it nice and snug. But this one, you wanna kind of squeeze together the ends because we're gonna put it face down, the pretty side down. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm being pretty gentle with this dough. The reason is the starter has worked really hard over the last most of the day building up the gas bubbles for us, and that's what's going to give us the little air pockets in our bread. That's what's going to continue to rise when we bake it, and so we don't want to take away all of its good work. If there's any giant bubbles, pop those, but the little ones we want to be gentle with. So that is looking really good, nice and snug on top. I'm gonna get some cornstarch sort of all the way around. I'm going to put that pretty side down. Putting a little cornstarch on top will actually help seal it if it wants to pull apart. So you just get that dusted and loosely lay this over top. I like to keep shower caps on hand to put over that also, to kind of just keep the moisture in. Now, these 2 loaves have entered their final fermentation stage. This is why I make 2 loaves. One, you can finish fermenting quickly at room temperature, get it to rise fully, and then bake it. And the other one, you can keep in the refrigerator for 1, 2, 3 days until the first loaf is about gone. And then you can make the other one, so you only have to work once and you get 2 loaves of bread over the course of several days. So that's why I like making the 2 loaves. All right, as we've already talked about, temperature plays a lot into the speed of fermentation for sourdough. And because it's so cold right now, I can expect this to take longer than it would ordinarily. Normally, you would be looking at about a 4-hour final fermentation. Then you could bake it. So if I wanted to keep one in my refrigerator, I would want to put it in there pretty much right away. Because now that it's this far along in its fermentation cycle, there's enough awake yeast in there to keep going even in the refrigerator. But because it has been so cold today, they're still a little sluggish and they're going to take their time. So I'm going to leave the one on the counter that I'm going to bake tomorrow. But the other one, the one that I'm going to put in the refrigerator and bake later, I still want to leave this on the counter for another couple of hours just to get it further along in its fermentation process. And then I'll put it in the refrigerator before I go to bed so that I can have it cold proof longer. Now, one more thing about cold proofing, you can finish all of the fermentation on the counter, bake your bread, and it will be delicious. Cold proofing is something that you're going to read a lot about. It is not necessary, but it is a fun little add-on. Cold proofing will allow it to develop more of the lactic bacteria, and that's the stuff that gives it the really sourdough tang. So if you like that tang, cold proof it for longer. If you want a more mild sourdough, do it only on the counter without the cold proofing. All right, it's been about 3 hours. Let's check on our dough. This is the one that we're going full utilitarian, so we can see it through the bowl, which is great. You can see it's risen some. It has that nice jiggle, that nice dome to it. The test to see if it's finished proofing or not is when you gently poke it and see if it springs back. The spring back is fantastic. This one's springing back fairly slowly, which means it's very far along in the fermenting process. So actually, I am going to put this in the refrigerator overnight to finish proofing, and then I will bake it in the morning. So I will put both of these in the refrigerator tonight, bake this one in the morning, and then leave this one in the refrigerator for a few more days, and then bake that when this one's almost gone. So even though it was cold today, it's nice that the sourdough starter will follow a predictable pattern with how it's going to ferment, how it's going to behave. So even though you can't say 4 hours and it'll be done, you can pretty much tell how long it's going to take once you get the hang of it. All right, you guys, it's time to bake our utilitarian no frills bread. So I have the Dutch oven heating up in the oven up to 425 degrees. Grab that out. Right here, you can either use a little olive oil or parchment paper. I have parchment paper, so we'll just set that in there. And then this guy gets unceremoniously picked up and plopped in. It has not come to room temperature. I just grabbed it out of the refrigerator, so it's still quite cold. Pop it in there. You can either leave it unscored, uncut, or I like to take some kitchen scissors and just snip the top. We've got a lovely little X pattern going on there, like hot cross buns. All right, lid goes on. In the oven for 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with the lid off, so we'll check it in 20 minutes. Just as a side note, what preheating the Dutch oven does is it makes that bread have an initial burst of super high heat, which is going to give it a lot of rise before it starts to solidify. So that's why we want to get that temperature up really high. And the lid on the pot keeps the moisture in while it's cooking. So the moisture evaporates out and then it's trapped and it stays in. That gives us the nice shiny gloss on the loaf. You do not have to have a lid on your pot. You will get a rustic, kind of more dry top looking loaf if you don't have a lid on, but if you do like that shiny classic sourdough look, a lid is what's gonna help you get that. If you don't have a Dutch oven, any pot with an oven safe lid can be used. Experiment, see what you've got. Go for it, you've got this. There goes the timer, ready to check it? We have finished our beautiful sourdough loaf. So you want to make sure that the internal temperature is between 190 and 210, but that happens to be the same as a skewer test. There we go. My thermometer needs to be whacked a few times to get it to go. Came out clean, so I know it's going to be up to temperature. So here we go. When it comes out of the oven, you want to take it out of its baking vessel right away because as it cools, it releases moisture, and if you leave it in the pot that it was baked in, it will condense and it will make it very wet and soggy, and we don't want that. Oh, so pretty. So, another way to tell if a loaf is done is if it sounds hollow on the underside, and this one does. Beautiful. No fuss, no muss, utilitarian loaf right there. Before you cut into it, you're going to want to let it cool because as it cools, it's going to continue solidifying with the steam that's trapped inside. So if you cut into it while it's still warm, you're going to get a little bit of a gummy, underbaked texture, which is totally fine if you're going to eat the whole thing at the dinner table. But if you want to save it and have the texture be still really nice for the next day or so, wait until it's cooled off before you cut into it. All right, that first loaf of bread is almost gone, so it's time to bake the second one. And for those of you who want the pretty sourdough breads, this is for you. This is what we're gonna do. Took it out of the refrigerator just now, so it's still nice and cold. And the cold is going to be key for you to be able to score it much more easily. If the bread was room temperature, it's much more difficult to score, so the cold ones are gonna be easier to make pretty. We're gonna open this up. I'm gonna fold this camera down so you can see it. And there's my computer. There we go. Ready? So you have it open. Get your parchment paper. I like to reuse parchment paper. Something hard to flip it over onto, and boop. There it goes. There is our beautiful loaf. What we're gonna do, we're gonna make a couple different scores. This is where you can really get creative, but my favorite way to do it is to do one deep score this way. So what we're gonna do, super deep, probably ½ an inch deep. And what I am using, this is just a razor blade. This came from a lame, I'm not sure, the stick that this is on, and it's curved like that. I did not like it at all. So I just took off the blade and I use it like this and I love it. Now this one I'm gonna show you, it's gonna look like a wheat stalk, which is super fun. So we're gonna pick a line. It's gonna go kind of like that and just zoop, zoop, zoop. Little scores all the way down and then matching ones on the other side. Easy peasy. So when this bakes, I'm gonna show you what it looks like. So exciting. So now I'm going to get the preheated Dutch oven out of the oven, set it right here, slide it in, and I'll show you how that process goes. Nice and hot. In it goes. Situate it with this parchment paper so it's in the center. All right, this is going in the oven. There we go, it's in the oven for 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with it off, and I'll show you what it looks like. All right, there's the timer. Let's see what we've got.
What's that?
Oh, you guys! Look at that. Oh, and it smells amazing. Let's check it with a skewer test. There we go. Skewer. Boom. Beautiful. Came out clean, so I can assume that it is at least 190 and between 190 and 210 because the skewer came out clean. Yes, my screw is my thermometer. You use what you've got. Again, we are going to take this out right away so that it doesn't form any condensation and get our loaf soggy. Oh, you guys. Woo, that's hot. Look how pretty. Happy baking.
You've got this.